So this problem that we are facing, I'm describing here, is simply what is being played off across the country right now today. And a lot of it has grown about as a result of just the changes that have occurred in neighborhoods because of the economics of real estate. And the advantages, because these areas, while they may have been poor, while they may have been distressed, had very good housing inventory. And a lot of stock is still very good today and it's being rehabbed, and in many places what's happening is it's being torn down and it's being redeveloped for market rate housing with no requirements. The District of Columbia, unlike the situation that I described in Montgomery County, does not have an equitable development policy. So there is no requirement that a private developer has to put back a certain amount of public housing. Now, another policy that's really important to think about, which I already talked about, is one-for-one replacement housing. When public housing in around 70, around that period of time, 70, 80, there was legislation that was approved by Congress as part of the housing bill that said that any public housing that was being removed had to be replaced unit for unit, one-to-one replacement. So if you took down 100 units of housing, there was public housing, you had to put back 100 units of housing. And so that was the policy that HUD mandated. That policy was removed from the books about 10 years ago. So it meant that you can now, so now you've got these programs like Hope 6 and others that are now again going back displacing public housing. Yes, that don't have to have one-for-one replacement. So that means you can go into a development. Before, the way this would work is if you went into Lafitte or into other projects or Peach or whatever, that if you had, like they had 1,200 units of housing there, public housing. On this policy, you had to put back 1,200 units of public housing. Not necessarily in the same location, but within the city. You have to be able to account for that, where they're going to go. Before the development can start on that site, you have to define where the housing is going to be for those 1,200 units. That don't mean the same 1,200 people, but it meant that there was a unit for unit replacement. Now, can you imagine that for a city that really does not have a lot of vacant real estate, and where the real estate costs have gone up significantly, that they can't compete now to buy the land to redevelop the units to make the one-for-one replacement? So that policy was relieved. It was removed from the books. And so now cities don't have that same challenge. Now some cities have enacted local legislation that provides the same one-to-one replacement. Most have not, because it's impossible for them to enforce that. Now,
what about the greater municipal picture? Because I mean, when you look at cities in Europe where they discovered long ago not to give up the city center, it is unaffordable to live in central London, central Paris, and therefore you have the outer ring suburbs becoming the place where the poor and the working poor live. Mm-hmm. And the inner ring suburbs in the U.S. are now starting to enter that phase of, is that where the poor wind up?
New York City.
No, but see, it's different though. See, the experience in the United States is just the opposite of that.
Exactly, except now are we seeing
but now we're experiencing that.
Yeah.
See, the U.S. experience was that in the 60s, when we started doing suburban development, started doing these tract developments around the country, what was happening, it became the way that people were moving from the city to the suburbs. And so cities became increasingly poor because you had less economics, because you had less people who were there who were either paying taxes of some kind or real estate taxes and things like that, and it was all moving to the suburbs. So the cities became increasingly concentration of poor living in the cities. Okay, while this was happening, this was also driven, which we don't want to forget, a lot of this was driven by race. Okay, it's race and economics. You know, low-income people, black people moving into neighborhoods, all of a sudden people started moving out to the suburbs. And that was happening, proliferated in the 60s all across the country. Wow. So these became really expensive to maintain these inner core areas at the same time where you were having decreasing amount of public investment. During the urban renewal days, and when I was there, we had so much money we couldn't even spend it all. Okay, I mean really, it was a little difficult. I mean, we were buying up so much real estate around the city. We literally bought, I would say, a third of the District of Columbia during those period of times on the different urban renewal plans. Today, so you had this concentration problems occurring. Now what's happening is that you have things like subway construction that's going on in inner cities. You have the issues around infrastructure, around culture and arts. Because that even though this movement was occurring with people, a lot of cities still had their good museums. They still had the symphony orchestra. They still had the facilities. They still had the infrastructure for entertainment. We're still in the cities. So even people who were living out here in the suburbs, they were coming back into the city to get access to some of those other amenities, all right? But then they go back to the cities. So as these things start, access became easier to the city, and real estate became, because what happened is that you had more real estate infrastructure than you had people to occupy it. So you have vacancies, and when that happens, the area begins to deteriorate. For example, right now, if I took you to Baltimore, Maryland, they have 40,000 vacant and abandoned units in the city because they have lost population. They have not enough population to occupy the housing, and so the housing deteriorates. So neighborhoods change and they go down. And so what's happening is that we are now starting to see people say, well, look, I'm getting, two things are happening. I've retired, and I don't want to continue to have that commute to these resources that I want to have access to. Or the children of the people who left here saying, man, you know, I like what's going on here. You know, they've got a whole new entertainment centers, there are the clubs that are there. You know, I want to be back in the city. That's where the thing is happening. And so they are moving back in, and the other thing that happened, interesting enough, you see, was in the issue around real estate titling. You see, when you bought a piece of property, it had to be a situation where the people were related individuals. A husband, a wife, a man and woman, but unrelated individuals could not buy real estate together and have it titled in both of their names. It was titled in one or the other. But now real estate laws allow you to have multiple people who are unrelated who can buy property. And so you have people who are coming back into the communities who are unrelated individuals who are buying inner city property, and just at large scale. And so they're changing the dynamics. You were mentioning Ted, neighborhood that he grew up in, Brookland area, Atlanta area, has always been a stable, middle-income neighborhood in the District of Columbia. And the Rhode Island Avenue Carter, that's an area now, as you were saying, people standing on the steps and they can sell a property there in that neighborhood for $500,000 and people will buy it like that. The biggest form of real estate sales, in a way, is the obituary. What people do is they go to the obituary not to see who died, they go to see who died because that means that property may be up for sale. Because their kids don't want to stay there anymore. The kids don't have the resources to keep the house up because they can't afford the house that mama paid $20,000 for that's now valued at $500,000. They can't pay the taxes on it. So they sell it. And so people use the obituary as a means to do real estate marketing. Isn't that interesting? It's really it's fascinating. So this whole dynamics of the market is changing. So now people are moving back in who have higher income or not leaving the city because that's where they went to school or whatever. That's where the jobs are. It's still, in the District of Columbia, for example, the center of employment has always been the District of Columbia. It's where the federal government is. The major employer is where the major infrastructure. So people are coming back to the city and are rediscovering into the neighborhoods where major public investment has been made because they were urban renewal, they were neighborhood development projects, they were others. So all this public money we have spent to build in the infrastructure is not benefiting the people who we want to give the first right to return to.
So the Negro removal label is still true today throughout every one of these iterations.
Exactly. And it's both color and economics that drives it, okay? And it's more economics now, almost in a way, but it affects people because of the fact that we have not changed the economic disparity between lower income people and higher income people. If anything, the gap has gotten bigger.